Welcome back to the Power of Copy. We are now on page, we are heading towards the 120th page of the story. So, where are we now? Madeline has gone to see the hospital administrator, that's Dana Westfield, and she's been told about a doctor called Bismarck Brown, that he was a doctor who treated or who attended to Lamley, her friend, after she had fainted, after they found out that something had happened to her. So she's now in Dr. Bismarck Brown's office and they're about to have a conversation. So that's where we are now. Let's continue with the story. This will make the 120th page of the story. So let's carry on. Okay, so Madeline stood up and gently smiled at him. He nodded in response and then walked. He nodded in response and then walked towards the table and casually said, "You were looking for me?" "Yes. My name is Attorney Madeline Boyson, and I'm here because of one Lamley O'Kine, the woman, the nurse whom you treated recently for some head injury." The doctor nodded and then sat down. "Yes, I was the one who attended to her. She suffered a concussion, though we don't know how it happened. No one saw her fall or hit her head against anything. It was sudden and quite worrying because we still don't know what happened to her. We still don't know what happened," Dr. Bismarck said, sounding genuine. He didn't look like he was lying, and that bothered her because everyone was saying the same thing, yet she still had doubt. The doctor was the last person she saw that day at the hospital. She left for the apartment right afterward, mainly because she was tired of hearing the same excuse. However, it wasn't over yet. Her former law tutor, Peter Brooks, was going to oversee the investigation into Lamley's sudden demise. She had already spoken to him days before coming to Canada, but as he was busy with the case, he could only meet her in 2 days' time. It was nearly midday when she got home. She dumped her handbag on the couch. And then proceeded to the kitchen, walking quickly. She gulped down a glass of water and then took out one of the soft drinks that Rob had bought in her honor and began to savor it in a casual way. She began to smile because it made her think of him. What an interesting host he was, to get a complete stranger a whole grilled chicken and some soft drinks. 5 minutes later, the bottle was empty, and then she took another and brought out some grilled chicken. 5 minutes later, the bottle was empty, and then she took out another and brought out the grilled chicken. It wasn't frozen, since she had placed it in the fridge before going to sleep the previous night. She felt hungry, but she wanted to cook. So she did. She washed up some rice and placed it into the cooker, and then began to prepare some accessory for it. Half an hour later, it was time to eat. She dished up and said a quiet prayer and began. It must have been a tasty meal since she finished it quickly, or could it be that her hunger made it tastier than it really was? While waiting for Peter Brooks, Madeline decided to learn more about head injuries. The doctor had told her what he knew, per his profession, but she needed to understand it in her own simple way. She Googled up the word concussion on the internet and read almost all the articles she found on it. According to one of the articles, symptoms of concussion could occur within minutes or hours after the head injury. However, on certain occasions, it could take days before the person experienced any symptoms. And that was the argument in her friend's case. She may have suffered a fall or hit her head at home and then experienced the effects later at the hospital. That made sense. But what if someone was behind it? She thought about it. And after some moments, something struck her. Did Lamley have a boyfriend? How come she never thought about that? She got up from her laptop and began to pace about in thought. If Lamley had someone in her life, then he could be the key to finding out what happened to her. If Lamley had someone in her life, then he could be the key. He could be the key to finding out what happened to her. She thought, and then quietly inhaled. So now Madeline has come back from the hospital. She's come to prepare some food with a grilled chicken that Rob, the property owner, bought for her. And now she's thinking about Lamley's demise. She's thinking about the head injury, the concussion she had. And so she's read the articles on the concussion, and she's just thought, what if Lamley had a boyfriend, okay? Maybe it was something due to domestic violence. And if there was a boyfriend, then he could be the key to unraveling what happened to her. What must have caused the concussion, okay? So that's where we are now. Let's continue the story. 48 hours later, the man she had been waiting for stood at her door. Peter Brooks was 60, tall, brown-skinned, and an African American. He met Madeline about 20 years ago in London, where he taught as a visiting law professor. 20 years is a long time to remember someone, but that's because they never lost touch with each other. On his last day at the university, she met him after the lecture to say goodbye. There, he gave her the means by which she could reach him. 4 phone numbers, one for his home, 2 for his office, and 2 for his personal use. He included his home and office addresses, and then a mailbox number. She had been calling him often, especially on his birthdays, and he had also been checking on her regularly, before and after she graduated law school. He was present at her graduation, and he stood in for a big brother or father. Madeline was not an orphan, but she had been alone for a long time, since her parents no longer communicated with each other. She was the second of 3 children and had 2 brothers. Her father had left for overseas when she was in junior high school. She was 13 years old by then. Later, her mother joined him, but she returned after a short while without him. That was right before she graduated junior high school at 15 years old. When Madeline asked her where he was, she didn't say. She never answered any question about him, and naturally, she figured out that something was wrong. Her father wasn't dead, contrary to what she thought. Okay, so now we're talking about the relationship that Madeline has with Peter Brooks, who was a former lecturer at law school. And where we are now, Madeline is recalling her parent relationship, okay? Before they were together, and then her father was based overseas and her mother joined him, but she came back without him, and then she wouldn't say anything about him, talk about him at all. So she thought they had divorced, okay? So that's where we are now in the story. When Madeline asked her where he was, she didn't say. She never answered any questions about him, and naturally she figured out that something was wrong. Her father wasn't dead, contrary to what she thought. He came back suddenly one day while she was at home and watching TV at the living room. At the time she was 16 years old. He just entered the room and called out her name, Madeline. She turned and saw him. She turned and saw him, and it felt like she was dreaming. Paul Boyson, her father, was casually but nicely dressed, wearing a beach-like shirt that had coconut trees and blue skies over some mid-calf blue jeans short. He had nothing in hand, but he appeared to have a lot to offer. He was about 45 years old, slightly dark and handsome, with shining, dark shaven hair. And he smelled like heaven. But before she could hack him, right before she could walk to him, her mother came in and cried out for him to get out. It was so sudden and frightening that she just froze where she stood. Her mother kept screaming for him to get out, and he responded by saying that the house was his, and she was the one who had to get out since they were no longer together. That was when Madeline learned the truth. Her father left after declaring that he wasn't going to abandon his children. Madeline was able to hack him, and he gave her something from his pocket. They were papers, white, crisp, and clean looking. They had some markings on them, and some images of men, and on the edges was the number 100. There were about 5 of them. Her mother was staring at her after he had given her the papers. Subsequently, he turned to look at her, and then she quickly looked away. He chuckled, and then Madeline chuckled too, not knowing what it was about. Madeline, I will see you again soon, okay? He said to her and then left. Peter sat at the kitchen with her to sip on some coffee. So now Martha has finished recollecting her father, okay, Paul Boyson. So now we're back to her talking with Peter in her house, okay, in the apartment she had hired. Remember, she's in Canada now, and she's come to Canada so she could find out what happened to her friend Lamley. And she's talking now with Peter Brooks, who is a lawyer and her former lecturer at law school. Peter sat at the kitchen with her to sip on some coffee, and there she told him about Lamley's incident. She started by stating that Lamley died in the hospital from a concussion, and according to the doctor, Bismarck Brown, she may have suffered the head injury at home or elsewhere, and then experienced the symptoms of the concussion later at the hospital. She added that she was all right when she came into the hospital that day on August 5, but later on in the day, around late morning or early afternoon, she complained of dizziness and then collapsed. Yet she was revived by the doctor, but not long after, she became unconscious again and then didn't come out of it. So this marks the 120th page of the story, The Power of Coffee. Okay? We'll be back for the next 10 pages to make it the 130th page of the story. So see you then.